Hey everyone, in this video what we're going to do is we're going to continue talking about ancient ethics. Here we're going to take a look at the concept of virtue. We'll start by picking up where we left off with Plato. We're looking at Socrates at the end of Euthyphro. Euthyphro ditches Socrates, says, I don't have time for this, I don't want to deal with this anymore, and leaves. And Socrates says, well, that's too bad, I thought I could use your help. And then Socrates himself has to go to court. Now, in Apology, another work by Plato, he goes to court, and here's what happens. So, on the left here, here's a brief summary of the charges against Socrates, that he was blaspheming the old gods, he was inventing new gods, he was corrupting the youth, and he was charging fees to spread his blasphemy and corruption. And so he goes before the court of Athens, basically the democratic body of Athens itself, and speaks in his defense. You know, I was just going around asking people questions, and they were giving unsatisfying answers, kind of like what Euthyphro was doing. He went to the poets, he went to the politicians, he went to the artisans, and that's what he's been doing. Apparently it's been upsetting people so much that people brought him up on charges. Socrates adds that he also believes he's on a divine mission to do this. He felt inspired by Apollo to go on this mission, asking people to questions to see who is really the wisest person of all, because according to his friend Chaerephon, who went to the oracle at Delphi, where there's a temple for Apollo, his friend Chaerephon was told Socrates is the wisest person in the world, to which Socrates responded, no, surely it's got to be someone else. And then he goes on this quest to ask people questions. Surely I got to find out that there's someone smarter than me. And he ends up being unsatisfied because everyone seems to be stupid. As a result here, the court says to Socrates, listen, we'll let you go if you just promise to shut up. To which Socrates says, listen, I'm on a divine mission to do this. I can't just shut up. This is obviously what I'm supposed to do, and we all as a society benefit from this, getting down to really what's important. The jury then decides to execute Socrates. And Socrates says, if that's how it's got to be, that's how it's got to be. And he says, for it's better for me to suffer injustice than to do injustice. You all are in the wrong, but I'm not going to do wrong because of your wrong. Two wrongs don't make it right. Finally, there are two other works by Plato I want to mention. There's Kryito, where his friends try and break him out of jail. Socrates, you don't have to do this, but he says, no, even though Athens is doing the wrong thing by executing me, I still have to obey the law. Even though I'm suffering injustice, I will not do injustice, despite the injustice going on here. He says, you gotta do what you gotta do. And then in Plato's work, the Phaedo, where Plato spends most of his time actually talking about his own philosophical stuff, at the very end of the Phaedo, nevertheless, there's a depiction of Socrates' death that we also see here in this painting by Jacques-Louis David, where here's Socrates, he's drinking hemlock poison, that's how he's going to be executed. He has to drink poison, his hand pointing upwards towards the things that are important. This body here doesn't matter, the stuff that's above does. Everybody's upset, this guy's crying over here uncontrollably, this person's inconsolable. And so this is the end of Socrates. And while that may have been the end of Socrates, it certainly wasn't the end of Greek philosophy or ethics. In fact, these works that we're reading right now were written by Plato, who has his own philosophical stuff that he does too, but one of the things that we have from Plato are the early things that Socrates did. Socrates himself didn't write anything down, or if he did, we don't have it. So a lot of that we get from Plato. Plato himself started a school in Athens called the Academy, from where we get our word today in English, academics, academia, and the academy itself, named after Plato's school. Now, Plato had several students at his academy, one of whom was a young Macedonian thinker named Aristotle. However, when Plato died, Plato's own nephew Chrysippus inherited the academy that Aristotle probably thought he was going to take over. So Aristotle ended up founding his own school called the Lyceum, also in Athens, but also Aristotle had the job of being tutor to Alexander the Great, who ended up conquering a lot of the ancient world in North Africa, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Near East, all the way to India. A lot of Greek influence was spread into those regions. So Aristotle did a lot, and he wrote a lot on pretty much every subject matter one could think of at the time, but we're going to take a look at a little bit of his ethics. So Aristotle begins his book, Nicomachean Ethics, with the opening line, every art and every inquiry and similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Nevertheless, there's a bunch of things that we do. There are many actions, many arts, many sciences, and their ends are all so many. Like, what's the purpose of shipbuilding is to build ships, and what's the purpose of nutrition, learning how to be healthy, and so on. And so everything we do, even if we're not conscious of what it is, we do it for some reason or some end or some aim. What then is the end or purpose or goal of what we do as humanity. For example, if an archer is supposed to hit a target, won't they hit the target better if they know that there is a target and what it is and what they should be aiming for? If we're human beings and we have a purpose or a goal, shouldn't we know what that target is? What's the target? And Aristotle says the thing that we are after, our purpose of human beings, what we're pursuing, our good, is happiness. Now, he doesn't use the word happiness in English. He uses this Greek word eudaimonia, which we translate as happiness. It doesn't mean the feeling of happiness, like that good feeling you've got. It means more than that. But he says everything that we do, like every decision that we make in life, we're doing it to try and acquire this thing called happiness. And it's not just being wealthy, it's not just enjoying pleasure, but having this notion of self-sufficiency, like you lack nothing, you're completely content with what is going on in your life. And so therefore happiness is the chief good, according to Aristotle. Happiness, or eudaimonia. Which then he turns to the question of, well, okay, if that's what we're after, we're trying to acquire happiness. How do we get there? How do we acquire it? The answer to the question we are asking is plain also from the definition of happiness, for it has been said to be a virtuous activity of the soul of a certain kind. But Aristotle says we get at this happiness by cultivating what he calls virtue, in Greek arete. And that Greek word for virtue, arete, translated into Latin, is virtus, which is where we get our English word virtue. So if virtue is the gateway to happiness, what's virtue then? So the word virtue literally means excellence. So when you think of virtues, they're the most excellent qualities someone could have. This is also why we call people who are excellent at, say, sports or playing a musical instrument a virtuoso, someone who has virtue. Aristotle says that when it comes to virtue, everything that we do as human beings, we ought to do well, especially what we do as human beings, which is go after happiness. We ought to do that well. We ought to pursue that excellently, virtuously, and how do we do that? Well, through a cultivation of character. So often when we're talking about ethics today in the 21st century, we're talking about what's right and wrong. Usually it comes down to some kind of consequentialist notion of ethics, that is, what's good is based on the consequences. So when we're talking about what's good and what's bad, we talk about whether the action's good or bad. That's not so much what Aristotle's interested in. If you want people to produce good actions and do good things, you need to have good people to start with. So for Aristotle, there's this relationship between ethos, who we are, our character, our disposition, and ethos, what we do. Even you can see the Greek words are related there, and they're related to our word in English for ethics. But basically, you want good people, you need them to have good habits. By habits, we mean continually repeated action. And eventually, this produces a process called ethizo, or habituation in English, which means continually repeated action. That means what we do is like muscle memory. Just like if you continue practicing a musical instrument, you start to know what to do without having to consciously think about it. Or if you play sports and practice sports, you can get to a point where you do it without thinking about it. Or if you play video games, you know that if you're told to press a certain button on your controller, you know what to do with your thumbs without having to look down and find it. Those are examples of habituation. Aristotle says that if we want to get at excellence, it's getting habituation down of those things which are most excellent for human beings to be successful. So what's that look like? So Aristotle says, by virtue, I mean virtue of character, for this pursues the mean because it's concerned with feelings and actions, and these admit of excess, deficiency, and an intermediate condition. We can be afraid, for instance, or be confident, or have appetites, or get angry, or feel pity. In general, have both pleasure and pain, both too much and too little, and in both ways not well, but having these feelings at the right times, about the right things, towards the right people, for the right end, that's purpose or reason or goal, and in the right way, is the intermediate condition. So Aristotle just postulated here what I also like to call the Goldilocks Principle, which is this. What a virtue is it's not too much of something, it's not too little of something, but it's the middle ground, it's just right. This is virtue is a mean between a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. It's not too much, it's not too little, it's just right. For example, take a look at this chart. So I've extrapolated this from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, but here is his list of virtues in the middle. Now, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but here's what virtues are. Virtues are the right middle ground between too much, or vices of excess. So it's not just that virtues are the opposites of vice, it's the middle ground between two vices. So, for example, courage is a virtue, but courage is a middle ground between rashness and cowardice. So, cowardice is a vice of deficiency. Problem comes up, you run away. That's a vice. There's a vice of excess, on the other hand. So you don't even have a problem. You're like, no, I'm going to fight for my life. That's rashness. Courage is in the middle. It's not running away from everything, but it's also not attacking everything either. Then also we've got the next one, temperance. Temperance, in today's lingo, that would be self-control. What are the vices there? Licentiousness. That's a vice of excess, just completely overdoing it. Someone, they're drunk all the time, intoxicated all the time, they have absolutely no self-control whatsoever, completely overdoing it. But on the other hand, there's a vice of deficiency. When someone is insensible, or they have the vice of insensibility, they're never having fun, they never want to have fun, and no one wants to be around them. That's still a vice. So, temperance, or self-control, is the middle ground between the two. Let's take a look at the third one, liberality. That'd be like, in today's lingo, that would be being generous, giving. Too much, prodigality, you give everything away all the time. You're giving all your money away. Stop it. But illiberality is you don't give anything away. You're the stingiest person ever. Liberality, being generous, is actually somewhere in the middle. Not giving away too much, but also not ever being giving either. And so again, for Aristotle, virtue is a mean between two vices, one of excess or overdoing it, and one of deficiency or underdoing it. And so if you want to figure out the kinds of virtues you are to cultivate, here they are. Don't do too much, don't do too little, and if you do these kinds of things, like Aristotle said, in the right contexts, for the right reasons, for the right end, generally speaking, this middle ground is the way to go if you want to develop good people. This is what we ought to teach people to do, to cultivate these virtues. And that's just it. You can't just teach someone these virtues. They have to be cultivated. You can't just be like, hey, here's how to be courageous, and you tell them, be courageous. Here's a test on being courageous. It doesn't work that way. From the get-go, you have to train people, and by people here I mean children, to make habits out of those particular excellencies. If you want someone to be courageous from a young age, you have to tell them, cowardice, no. Brashness, though, also no, if you want them to be courageous. And again, it has to be cultivated and developed. Having all this in the background, we can kind of talk about a more cohesive view of virtue ethics. So in summary, in virtue ethics, that which is moral is evaluated with respect to the character of the active moral agent, the person doing the work, rather than their actual actions themselves. So sometimes it's called agent ethics as opposed to action ethics. And so here are the key general claims of Aristotelian virtue ethics. First off, the kind of person that we are, right being, is more important than the right action. If you want to get those right actions out of people, you develop the right kind of character. Secondly, a virtue is a character trait or disposition to habitually act in a manner that benefits oneself and others. So if you're continually cultivating, as I said, those virtues by the process of habituation or ethizo, which is where you make the regular practice of virtuous behavior, you make a habit out of virtue by continually avoiding those vices of excess and deficiency, and you act in such a way that it benefits yourself and others out of a disposition of good character. Because a third point here, a virtuous person is more likely to do what's right. Sometimes it's a roll of the dice. Will they do the right thing? If you cultivate virtue, someone who is virtuous intrinsically will be good because they're a good person and good actions will result. It's not that you become a good person by doing good actions. You are a good person by having a good character. And that virtue, that excellence, contributes to our moral well-being, being good persons, as well as our happiness. When we cultivate that virtue, we become better human beings. And we acquire that happiness, or eudaimonia, that Aristotle was talking about. Again, it's not a fleeting feeling of happiness. It's really like a fully fledged, flourishing human being. So this has been a summary of Aristotle's virtue ethics, which historically is one of the most dominant ethical perspectives in the world. Aristotle's ethics goes on to be a dominant position in the Islamic world, especially with the Islamic philosophy of Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, and certainly in the Christian tradition with philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and Francisco Suarez. In fact, in the so-called Western world, Aristotelian ethics isn't really challenged until the period of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. In fact, Martin Luther, or as we call him in English, Martin Luther, goes so far as to say that you can't really do theology correctly unless you get away from Aristotle. I mean, look at these hot takes from Martin Luther. Virtually the entire ethics of Aristotle is the worst enemy of grace. It is an error to say that no man can become a theologian without Aristotle. Indeed, no one can become a theologian unless he becomes one without Aristotle. Briefly, the whole Aristotle is to theology as darkness is to light. You see, Martin Luther, not a fan of Aristotle. So what I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to talk about some other ancient Greek and Roman traditions on the notion of virtue. So there are some other schools of thought that differ from Aristotle on what exactly virtue is and what virtue should be cultivated, but nevertheless agree that it's something that ought to be cultivated in our character. That's something you see throughout Greek and Roman ethics. So I'm going to go just over a couple of the other popular schools of ethical thought in the ancient European world. After that, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about ancient Chinese ethics too. Just a little bit on the ancient Chinese ethics of Kongzi and Mozi.